I remember the morning very well. It was still dark, the desert dark of New Mexico, which is not like any other darkness, because even at night the land seems to hold light within itself, as if the mesas and the dry arroyos have stored the sun and are releasing it slowly, reluctantly, into the hours before dawn. I was standing at the base camp 10 miles from the tower, and I was holding onto a post because I was not entirely sure my legs would support me. I weighed perhaps 120 pounds in those days. I had not slept. None of us had slept. And I remember thinking, with the strange clarity that exhaustion sometimes gives, that what we were about to witness was not an explosion in any ordinary sense of the word, but something more like a question, posed to the universe in a language we had only just learned to speak, and whose answer we were not at all certain we wished to hear. That was the morning of July 16, 1945, the Trinity test. And what happened in the microseconds after 5:29 a.m.? The light, the heat, the shock wave that knocked men down at 10 miles. All of it began with a single event so small that no human eye could ever see it, so brief that no human clock could ever measure it. It began with the splitting of one atom. I should like to think a little about what that means. Not merely in the language of physics, which is precise and necessary, but in the larger language of what we are, what we have done, and what we must now live with. Because the story of nuclear fission is not, in the end, a story about atoms. It is a story about us, about the strange and terrible privilege of understanding, about the moment when knowledge, which we rightly hold as among the highest of human goods, became indistinguishable from the power to destroy everything we have ever built or loved or hoped for. And I do not think we have yet reckoned honestly with what that means. Let me be precise about this, because precision matters, and because the failure to be precise about the physics has led to a great deal of confusion about the morality. An atom, let us take uranium-235, since that is where this story begins, and, in a certain sense, where it ends. An atom of uranium-235 has a nucleus containing 92 protons and 143 neutrons, bound together by what we call the strong nuclear force. This force operates over a range of roughly 1 femtometer, that is, 1 quadrillionth of a meter, or 10 to the negative 15th power. At this scale, the force is extraordinarily powerful. It must be, because those 92 protons, each carrying a positive electrical charge, are repelling one another with tremendous electromagnetic force, and it is only the strong force, acting between neighboring nucleons like a kind of molecular glue, that holds the whole structure together. But here is the first thing one must understand. This nucleus is not comfortable. It is not at rest in the way that a stone on a hillside is at rest. A nucleus with 92 protons is, in a manner of speaking, barely holding itself together. The electromagnetic repulsion, which, unlike the strong force, reaches across the entire nucleus, is very nearly winning. The uranium-235 nucleus exists in a state of profound tension, a balance so delicate that the arrival of a single additional neutron, moving slowly enough to be captured, a thermal neutron we call it, with a kinetic energy of roughly 1/40th of an electron volt, is sufficient to tip the balance. The nucleus absorbs this neutron, becomes uranium-236 for a fleeting instant, perhaps 10 to the negative 14 seconds, and then it can no longer hold. It deforms, elongates like a droplet of water stretching under its own weight, and splits. This is fission. The word comes from the Latin fissio, a cleaving, a splitting apart. It was Lise Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch who first understood what was happening in December of 1938, walking in the snow near Kungälv in Sweden, working out the physics on scraps of paper while the world around them was preparing for war. Meitner, who had collaborated with Otto Hahn in Berlin for 30 years, who had been forced to flee Germany because she was Jewish, who received no Nobel Prize for this work while Hahn did. Meitner saw that the nucleus was behaving like the liquid drop that Bohr and John Archibald Wheeler would soon describe mathematically. She saw that when the uranium nucleus split into two lighter nuclei, barium and krypton roughly, the total mass of the fragments was less than the mass of the original. And she knew, because Einstein had told us all in 1905 that mass and energy are the same thing, related by that equation which has become, to my lasting unease, a kind of cultural talisman. The mass deficit in a single fission event is approximately 0.1% of the original mass. This sounds negligible. It is not. Because when you calculate the energy released, using Einstein's relation E equals mc squared, where c is the speed of light, 300 million meters per second, you find that a single atom of uranium-235, upon fissioning, releases approximately 200 million electron volts of energy. 200 million electron volts from one atom. A chemical reaction, the burning of a molecule of coal, say, releases perhaps 4 electron volts. The ratio is something like 50 million to 1. I want to dwell on this number because it is the number upon which everything turns. 50 million to 1. It means that the nuclear forces binding the constituents of matter contain, locked within them, energies that are to chemical energies what a hurricane is to the breath of a sleeping child. And this energy was always there, in the rocks beneath our feet, in the walls of our houses, in the bones of our bodies. We did not create it. We merely found the key to release it. And here, I think, one begins to sense the peculiar horror of the thing, because the question is not whether such energy exists. It does. It always has. It is woven into the fabric of matter itself. But whether beings such as ourselves, with our particular blend of brilliance and foolishness, our capacity for both great tenderness and unspeakable cruelty, ought to have been the ones to find that key. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me return to the physics, because the physics is not finished, and it is in the next step that the true catastrophe, if I may use so strong a word for something so elegantly simple, reveals itself. When a uranium-235 nucleus fissions, it does not merely split into two fragments and release energy. It also emits, on average, 2.4 free neutrons. This is the fact that changed the world. Not the energy release alone. That was remarkable, but it might have remained a laboratory curiosity, a phenomenon of purely scientific interest, had it not been for those neutrons. Because each of those neutrons is capable of being captured by another uranium-235 nucleus, causing it too to fission, releasing its own energy and its own neutrons, which strike other nuclei, which fission, which release still more neutrons, and so on, in a cascade that doubles and redoubles with each generation. This is the chain reaction. Enrico Fermi demonstrated it for the first time on December 2nd, 1942, beneath the squash courts at the University of Chicago. Stag Field, they called it, using a pile of uranium and graphite blocks that he controlled with cadmium rods, absorbing just enough neutrons to keep the reaction from running away. It was, by any measure, one of the most consequential experiments in the history of the human species, and it was conducted with an elegance and a calm that I have always found both admirable and, in retrospect, somewhat chilling. Now, in a controlled reaction, a reactor, one arranges for exactly one neutron from each fission event, on average, to cause another fission. The multiplication factor, which we call K, equals 1. The reaction sustains itself, but does not grow. This is what we want for power generation, for the peaceful applications that we spoke of with such hope in those early years, hope that I still hold, though it has been tempered by what came after. But if one assembles a sufficient quantity of fissile material, what we call a critical mass, which for uranium-235 is approximately 52 kilograms, a sphere roughly the size of a grapefruit, and if one arranges the geometry so that the neutrons cannot escape fast enough, so that K exceeds 1, then the reaction does not merely sustain itself, it grows exponentially. In the space of roughly 1 microsecond, 1/1,000,000th of a second, the chain reaction in a fission weapon undergoes approximately 80 generations of doubling. 80 generations. 2 to the 80th power is a number so large that it defies ordinary comprehension. It is approximately 1.2 times 10 to the 24th. In that single microsecond, more energy is released than a large power station produces in a month. This is what fell on Hiroshima at 8:15 in the morning on August 6, 1945. A device we called Little Boy, and there is something almost obscene about that name, as if by making it small and childlike we could domesticate the thing, containing approximately 64 kilograms of uranium-235, of which less than 1 kilogram actually fissioned. Less than 1 kilogram. And that incomplete, inefficient, crude device, for it was crude by any standard of engineering, released energy equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. 15 kilotons. The fireball reached a temperature of several thousand degrees. Everything within a radius of 1 mile was obliterated. By the end of 1945, approximately 140,000 people were dead. 3 days later, Nagasaki. A different design, a plutonium implosion device, the kind we had tested at Trinity. 21 kilotons. 70,000 dead by the end of that year. I have read a great deal of moral philosophy, and I have read a great deal of theology, and I have read the Bhagavad Gita many times, in Sanskrit, with my teacher Arthur Ryder at Berkeley. And I will tell you that nothing in any of those texts prepared me adequately for the task of holding those numbers in my mind alongside the knowledge that I had played a part in bringing them into being. The Gita speaks of dharma, of duty that must be fulfilled regardless of personal anguish, of action that is necessary even when the consequences are terrible. Krishna tells Arjuna on the field of Kurukshetra that he must fight, that the war is already decided, that the warriors on the opposing side are already dead by divine will, and that Arjuna is merely the instrument. I understood that passage once as a kind of consolation. I understand it now as something far more complicated, as a description of the trap that knowledge sets for those who seek it, a trap from which there is no escape, that does not involve either dishonesty or despair. And here one must be honest about something that is not easy to be honest about. We knew. Not all of us, and not all at once, but we knew from a very early stage what we were building and what it would do. There was a petition. Leo Szilard organized it in July of 1945, urging that the bomb be demonstrated before the Japanese on an uninhabited island rather than used against a city. I did not sign it. I did not circulate it. I allowed the military and political leadership to make the decision, and I provided them with the technical means to carry it out. One might say, and I have said at various times to various audiences, that the decision to use the weapon was not mine to make. This is true. It is also, in a sense that I have come to feel more and more acutely with each passing year, not entirely sufficient as a moral accounting. Because there is a difference. And it is a difference that I think matters very much between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge tells you that the chain reaction will work, that the critical mass can be assembled, that the yield will be approximately such and such. Wisdom, if such a thing exists, and I am not certain that it does, but I think we must act as if it does, wisdom would tell you what to do with that knowledge. And wisdom, I am afraid, was in rather short supply at Los Alamos and in Washington and in all the capitals of the world during those years. We knew abundance. What we lacked, what we have always lacked, and what the physicist's sin consists in having made so desperately urgent, was the wisdom to match it. One finds in the history of science a recurring pattern that I think is worth examining because it bears directly on the question of fission and its consequences. It is this: the deepest discoveries are rarely made because someone set out to make them. They are made because someone was curious about how the world works, because they found a problem beautiful, because, as I have said before and will say again because I believe it to be true, the deep things in science are not found. After all, they are useful. They are found because it was possible to find them. Hahn and Strassmann in Berlin in 1938 were not trying to build a weapon. They were trying to understand what happened when you bombarded uranium with neutrons. They were puzzled. They expected to find elements close to uranium in the periodic table. Instead, they found barium, element 56, roughly half the mass of uranium, and they could not explain it. It was Meitner, in exile, who understood, and Frisch, her nephew, who named it fission, after the biological process of cell division. The beauty of the discovery was real. Let me not pretend otherwise. There is, in the moment of understanding, when the pieces fall into place, when what was obscure becomes clear, when the mathematics and the physical world align, a joy that is unlike any other human experience. I have felt it. Every physicist has felt it. And I think it would be dishonest. It would be a form of false piety to deny that the work at Los Alamos, for all its terrible purpose, had moments of that joy. When you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and you argue about what to do about it only after you have had your technical success. I said that once. I have regretted the way it sounds ever since. But I have not been able to say that it was untrue. And this, I think, is the heart of the matter. The thing that makes the story of fission not merely a story about physics, but a story about the human condition itself. We are creatures who are compelled to understand. It is not a choice. It is, and I use this word deliberately, an organic necessity. The same curiosity that led our distant ancestors to wonder about the stars, to plant seeds and see what grew, to mix pigments and make images on cave walls. That same curiosity led us, by a path that now seems almost inevitable, to the interior of the atom, to the forces that bind the nucleus, to the terrible energy stored there. And having arrived, we could not unknow what we knew. You cannot unsplit the atom. You cannot undiscover the chain reaction. You cannot return to the world as it was before December 1938, before December 1942, before July 1945. The Greeks, who understood these things better than we do, or at least more honestly, told the story of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind, and was punished for it eternally. It is a story about the cost of knowledge, but it is also, and this is the part that is usually forgotten, a story about the impossibility of refusing knowledge. Prometheus did not have a choice, not really. The fire existed. The capacity to take it existed. And once a being capable of understanding confronts a truth that can be understood, the act of understanding is, in some deep sense, already accomplished.
But, and here we arrive at something more difficult,
the inevitability of discovery does not remove the burden of consequence. This is the error that I see made again and again by scientists and by statesmen, by those who wield power and by those who merely study it. They say, it was inevitable, therefore no one is responsible. They say, if we had not done it, someone else would have, therefore we are absolved. And both of these statements contain a truth, but neither of them contains the whole truth. And the difference between a partial truth and the whole truth is, in matters of this gravity, the difference between comfort and honesty. I have been wrong about many things in my life. I was wrong about the hydrogen bomb, not in opposing it, which I still believe was right, but in believing that my opposition could prevent it. I was wrong about certain people whom I trusted and should not have trusted, and about other people whom I failed to trust and should have. I was wrong in thinking that the extraordinary concentration of talent we assembled at Los Alamos, Bethe, Teller, Fermi, von Neumann, Feynman, Segre, and so many others, that this concentration of brilliance would be matched by an equivalent wisdom about how to manage what we had created. It was not. Genius is no guarantee of wisdom. Any man whose errors take 10 years to correct is quite a man. I said that about Einstein, and I meant it as praise, but it applies with equal force and considerably less praise to myself. There are children playing in the streets who could solve some of my top problems in physics, because they have modes of sensory perception that I lost long ago. And I think sometimes that there are people, ordinary people, people who have never heard of the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, or Fermi's pile, or the liquid drop model of the nucleus, who understand the moral dimension of what we did better than any of us who did it, because they understand it not as theory, not as physics, not as strategy, but as a fact about human beings, that 140,000 people in Hiroshima and 70,000 people in Nagasaki were real, that they had names and faces and families and futures that were taken from them in a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns. And that understanding, which requires no physics at all, only the basic human capacity for empathy, may be closer to wisdom than anything I have ever possessed. One might stop here and feel that the picture is complete. It is not. Because the story of fission did not end at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Within 4 years, the Soviet Union tested its own device. Within 7 years, the hydrogen bomb, a weapon that uses fission merely as its trigger, the way one might use a match to light a furnace, had been tested by both nations. The yield of the first hydrogen bomb, Ivy Mike, in November of 1952, was 10.4 megatons, 10,400,000 tons of TNT equivalent. That is roughly 700 times the yield of Little Boy. And the Soviet Tsar Bomba, tested in 1961, yielded 50 megatons. The fireball was 5 miles in diameter. The mushroom cloud rose 40 miles into the atmosphere. The shock wave circled the Earth 3 times. At the peak of the Cold War, the combined arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union contained approximately 70,000 nuclear warheads. 70,000. The total explosive yield was sufficient to destroy every major city on Earth several times over, a concept for which we coined the term overkill, as if the language of excess could somehow domesticate the reality of annihilation. And all of it, every warhead, every missile, every submarine lurking beneath the Arctic ice with enough firepower to end civilization, all of it traces back to that single physical fact, that a neutron, moving slowly enough, can split a uranium nucleus, and that the splitting releases more neutrons, and that the process, once begun, feeds upon itself. There is a passage in the 11th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita where Arjuna asks Krishna to reveal his true form, not the human guise in which he has appeared, but his cosmic form, the Vishvarupa, the form of all forms. And Krishna obliges. And what Arjuna sees is not beautiful, or rather, it is beautiful and terrible at once, a vision of infinite creation and infinite destruction, of all beings rushing into the mouths of flame, of time itself as a devouring force. And Arjuna is terrified, and he begs Krishna to return to his familiar shape. And Krishna does. But Arjuna has seen. He cannot unsee. I have thought about that passage more than any other, because it seems to me to describe, with a precision that no scientific paper could match, the experience of understanding fission, of understanding, truly understanding, what it means that the energy binding the nucleus can be released. It is a vision of power so vast that it exceeds all human categories. And once you have seen it, once you have held the numbers in your mind, once you have calculated the yields and the radii and the casualties, you cannot return to innocence. You can only go forward, carrying what you know. And this must give us some honesty, some insight, which will be a source of strength. I said that once, at a time when I still believed, or wanted to believe, that the experience of the bong could be transmuted into something redemptive. I am less certain of that now than I was then. But I remain certain that the alternative, the refusal to think about it, the retreat into either despair or denial, is worse, because the physics is real. The chain reaction is real. The weapons exist, and they will continue to exist, and the knowledge that created them will never be lost. The question before us, the only question that matters, is whether beings capable of splitting the atom are also capable of the wisdom, the restraint, the profound and sustained moral seriousness required to live in the world that splitting the atom has created. I do not know the answer. I have asked myself many times, and I do not know. But I know that we cannot afford to stop asking, because the moment we stop asking is the moment we have surrendered the one thing that distinguishes us from the blind forces of nature, the capacity to choose, to reflect, to say, this we will do, and this we will not. The peoples of this world must unite, or they will perish. I said that in 1945, and it is truer now than it was then. The physics will not save us. The physics is indifferent. It does not care whether it is used to light a city or to burn one. Only we can make that distinction. Only we can choose. When I was young, very young, before Cambridge, before Göttingen, before the war, before all of it, I used to ride horses in New Mexico, in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, through country so beautiful that it seemed impossible that anything terrible could exist in the same world. The light on the mesas in the late afternoon had a quality, I do not know how to describe it except to say that it was like a physical manifestation of the word clarity. Everything was sharp and golden and still. And I remember thinking that if one could only understand the world clearly enough, if one could see it whole, the way that light seemed to illuminate it, then one would know how to live in it. One would know what to do. But we depend on our choices. We are not only scientists, we are men too. We cannot forget our dependence on our fellow men. And if we have learned anything from the splitting of the atom, anything at all from this long and terrible and beautiful and unfinished story, it is that science is not everything. But science is very beautiful. And the beauty, like the power, carries obligations that we cannot refuse and dare not forget.